Coming up next on the Breadwinning Mums.
So a classic example was the story of a musician who went to the Buddha and said, how do I tune my, it was like a lyre or something, like it was something with strings. How do I tune it so that it makes the most perfect noise? And the Buddha said, not too tight, not too loose. And then when you leave the mat and you go out into the world, every interaction you have for the next week, how can I think not too tight, not too loose, as I support my kid, as I have a conversation with my partner, as I fill in the blank?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Breadwinning Mums podcast. This is a place where we debunk the myths of working mums, cheer each other on, and show the world that you can be a mum and still pursue excellence in your chosen area of expertise. Dr. Tamsin Astor is a neuroscientist for founders and teams, a habit and leadership strategist, and an overall good human being. Tamsin shared her life story of navigating 2 cancer episodes in her young son's life, finding inner alignment and asserting her sovereignty in her first marriage, and entering 50s with so much richness and joy and the safety to flourish as her full self. I know you'll enjoy this conversation with Dr. Tamsin Astor. Dr. Tamsin Astor, welcome to the Breadwinning Mums podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's fabulous to be here.
So good to see you again. So, Tamsin, we met at the $1 Million Roundtable annual meeting last year, and it was a really quick connection that we had with each other. And I felt like it was just the transparency, I guess, and the honesty and the humility that you shared with me that really captivated me as who you are as a person. And then I learned to know who you are professionally as well. Extremely accomplished person, extremely experienced human being. But before we go into all of that, I'm just going to start with a very simple question. Who are you as a human, Tamsin?
That's a good question. I think, so a couple of things jump to mind. The first is I'm really driven by relationships. Relationships are really what define my life, what keep me grounded. And it's what's been interesting as I've gotten older is I grew up in a home where one of the things that my mother said to me very early on was, if you want to have deep, intimate connections with people, you need to be comfortable and willing to share what's hard and not just the sort of the glory, right? And so I learned from a very young age the importance of, really opening up. This is what I'm finding hard. This is what I'm struggling with. This is what's difficult in my life. And that's how all my relationships are. And honestly, I don't have relationships with people who are not willing to go there. I just sort of move on. So relationships, I think, are the thing that define me. I think freedom is another thing that's a really big part of who I am and how I show up in the world. And it's one of my core values, which is that I want people to feel free. And I don't mean that in the kind of Second Amendment rights kind of way. I mean it more in the, I live in the United States, even though I've got a transatlantic British accent after 24 years. I mean it as freedom to make the kind of money that you want to live the life you want, freedom to spend time with the people that you want to be with, freedom to be intellectually and emotionally honest in your relationships, freedom to access healthcare. So really that's how I think of freedom, right? So physical freedom, temporal freedom, emotional freedom, physical freedom, right? And the other thing that I think is a sort of very core feature of who I am, and one of the things that was interesting when I did my first yoga teacher training nearly 20 years ago, is being of service, right? Being compassionate, aiming for being loving with people. And I had a therapist at one point in the past who said, you're gullible. That's why you get hurt. And I said, I'd rather go into the world expecting people to treat me well and that I'm going to treat them well and to be loving and kind, until they prove me wrong. Like, I'm never going to go into the world expecting people to be mean and cruel. And that's just not my MO, and I grew up in central London and I live in Brooklyn. So it's not like I live in, tiny little hometowns where people leave their doors unlocked. So I'm realistic. But I think those are the sort of core features of who I am as a human.
Yeah, awesome. That sovereignty, I think, was one of the key word that you mentioned when we first met, and I really like it.
Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to take us back to way back when, Central London. What was the young Tamsin like?
So I grew up in a home with parents and my maternal grandparents who told me they loved me multiple times a day. So I grew up very secure in, who I am and that I was wanted and loved and, worthy, which was
Mm,
wonderful. I also grew up in a home which was very intellectually open and adventurous. My father is a psychoanalyst. My mother was an educational psychologist.
oh,
And
wow.
there was a meeting of the worlds of East and West too, because my grandmother was psychic. She'd say things like, if I was alive 400 years ago, I would have been burned at the stake, darling. So she was witchy, in that she would see things before they happened. I had a terrible accent when I was 11, and she called my mother and said, you need to find her, something's happened to her. My mother's like, she's fine, she's at school. And she called the school and I hadn't arrived at school. I'd fallen face first off a London bus, and my grandmother just knew that this had happened.
Wow.
So she was
Wow.
psychic and used aromatherapy and homeopathy. So I grew up in a world where that was fine. My father was a psychoanalyst, that was fine. My uncle was an OBGYN and medical. So this idea that you had to sort of choose one track was never part of
Yeah.
my life, right? And I was also one of those people who, as a child, I went to all girls schools, which I think was helpful because I was nerdy, and it allowed me to be nerdy and not have to worry about the male competition, right? And I was good at everything but not brilliant at anything, which I was one of those people that, like, I could put my mind to anything and I could be a sort of A-B+ student in languages, in art, in science. I was in the second 11, which is like the not the first team but the junior team for for netball, which is this sort of British equivalent of basketball, for hockey, for, like, I was good at everything but not great at anything. And that played out also in my friendships. I was in the kind of middle group, but I was cool enough that the cool kids would invite me to their parties, and I was
Yeah.
nerdy enough that the
Yeah.
nerds would ask me to help them with their chemistry homework.
Yeah. 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 That's a sweet spot. That's where you want to be when
Yeah.
you grow up, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No,
That
it
is
was great.
awesome.
And it was really fun. And I think one of the things that I was very lucky about is my grandmother was one of those people who, anytime I showed a remote interest in anything, whether it was knitting or horse riding or ice skating, she'd like get me a class, buy me the equipment and go, just try it out. Like, this might be your thing. So
Yeah.
I grew up in a very loving, emotionally connected, supportive, loving home. And it allowed me to learn how to be expressive and to sort of step into who I was, right, and not be kind of limited by being female or any of those other things that could have been limiting factors.
Yeah, interesting. Did that give you some difficulties growing up? That inner confidence to show up as who you are in a world that is potentially sometimes not quite ready?
Yeah, I mean, there were a couple of things. One was, it was interesting when I went to sign the paperwork for my postdoctoral fellowship at WashU St. Louis in the early 2000s. The woman said, "Oh, you've just, you've fulfilled our minority quotient." And I looked at her and I went, "I'm white, I'm female, I'm middle class, I have a PhD. Can you explain to me how I'm a minority?" And she said, "You're a woman." And it was the first time in my life, I was 25, that I'd ever thought of myself as a minority, which it
Yeah.
shows you the level of privilege that I grew up with, that it had never occurred to me, because I had access to all of this amazing, education and love and connection and travel and sort of, stimulation. But it was also one of those things that I was like, huh, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I also was somebody who, I was diagnosed with ADHD a couple of years ago.
Mm.
And in retrospect, I look back at my early education and think, wow, if I'd known that then, and they'd known,
Mm.
like, they didn't know in the 80s that women could have ADHD. Like, women were excluded from the diagnosis. And I said to the psychologist who tested me, how did I get to my 40s and not know? And he said, when you have a high IQ, that's a great protector, because you constantly create strategies. And ironically, I created an entire business around building habits, because I was struggling, and I was like, there must be a better strategy for this, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I look back and I think maybe I could have really flown in something if the diagnosis and support of that had been available to me as a young child.
Yeah. Interesting. So for us lay people who don't have a PhD in neuroscience and psychology and psychoanalysis, how would you explain that? How would ADHD translate in everyday occurrences?
Sure. So I'll give you an example. One of the things that is tough when you have ADHD is to focus in certain environments and navigate. We've heard a lot about dopamine, and it's related to the feedback you get. So every time you post something on social media and you get a hit, you get that dopamine. You're like, oh, somebody liked it,
Mm.
somebody shared it, somebody commented, right? People with ADHD require more of that to get tasks done. So, for example, like unloading the dishwasher, putting away laundry, very low dopamine. I've had to learn to like gamify that so that it gets done, right? Like putting on
Interesting.
music, making it a competition, changing the color, folding things in a certain way, right? In school, one of the things that it is that kind of I was protected by inadvertently was that we sat in alphabetical order, because my last name was A. This is
Yeah.
my birth name. I was right in front of the teacher. If I had been a B, a C, a D, an F, and been further back from the teacher, the
Yeah.
distraction would have made it really hard for me to concentrate. That's one
Mm.
example. Another is rejection sensitivity disorder. So people with ADHD perceive slights in a much more heightened sense. So people with
Mm.
ADHD, if somebody looks at you in a particular way, you're like, oh, I've offended them, right? And it
Yeah.
creates this sort of scar tissue, for want of a better description. And so,
Yeah.
when you think about school and you think about not being picked for the team, not being
Yeah.
picked for the group project, being told that your work was okay, but not great, you get stuck on these. So then every time anybody gives you feedback, even if it's useful and constructive, it contributes to this sort of scar tissue of rejection sensitivity dysphoria. And what that creates, and I've struggled with in my business. So, for example, cold outreach is something that every time I've tried to use that strategy in my business, I shrink, because
Mm.
it doesn't even have to be and I'm not interested. It can be somebody ignoring 3 reach outs, and they hate me, what I'm doing is awful, I'm not useful, the thing I'm trying to serve is not, right? So those are
Yeah.
some of the examples of how ADHD can, manifest in all of life, but particularly as a young child.
Interesting. So, as someone who works with children with ADHD, either through yoga and with your professional background as well, we may have parents with ADHD, well, kids with ADHD. How would you recommend they navigate this lifestyle, I guess?
Yeah, so I don't do that any longer, but I did for a while. And one of the first things I say to people is learning to regulate your nervous system is really important.
As a
So,
parent, first and
as a
foremost.
parent first, so that
Yeah.
every time you engage with the child, you're coming from a place of grounded energy, right? So I
Mm.
teach a program called Conscious Leadership, and it's all about journaling and reflecting on how you show up, meditation, breath work, how to ask good questions. And one of the things that's really interesting is people come into that program for work and they'll often say a few weeks in, oh, I'm having so much better conversations with my 15-year-old or my husband. I came here to figure out how to be a better team leader or boss or whatever, right? So one of the things I'll say to people is, before you open your mouth, particularly if it's going to be a challenging conversation, breathe. Like, integrate your mind and your body through the action of breath, right? So that's one example. Second is, people with ADHD do a couple of things which can be hard for others. And I have 3 children with ADHD. So it's also the irony of like me not recognizing it until they'd also all been diagnosed and live with it. But people with ADHD tend to do 2 things which people around them can find hard. One is their anxiety, which is more to do with, am I showing up well? Am I offending people? It's more driven by that kind of like how they're showing up socially. And social anxiety is often comorbid with ADHD, is they will verbally process everything. So everything comes out of their mouth, right? And people with ADHD, they're just trying to make sense. They're like, is this how I feel? Am I doing this right? And people around them can find that frustrating. The second is navigating the anxiety in terms of, the social anxiety piece, right? So how you engage with others, and the sort of I kind of sometimes talk about it as like the prep work before you go into a situation, right? So it might be like the sort of fear of having to stand up in front of the classroom and do a presentation, or the fear of holding a boundary, right? And sort of learning how to navigate through that. And one of the things that people with ADHD often do is they will overshare, right? So for example, with a boundary, one of the things I often teach my clients is no is a complete sentence, right? People with ADHD will tend to over-explain their no to make the other person feel better, through that kind of like oversharing. Like, the reason I'm saying no is that I've got 57 things on my calendar right now and I really, really need to sleep and I'm in perimenopause, rather just going, no, I can't do that. Right?
Yeah.
And or whatever it is, but that oversharing, and then that creates a shame hangover. Right?
Yeah.
This whole like, you wake up the next morning and you're like, I can't believe I told my boss XYZ. I can't believe I told my friend. Yeah, right. So pause, notice, choose. That's a sort of very simple framework I use. Pause, breathe, get into my body, notice how I'm feeling, notice the situation, notice what's going on around me, and choose something that's in alignment with your values.
Awesome. Thank you.
Welcome.
You have 3 beautiful kids. Did you know that you were going to be a mom growing up?
From day one. I wanted to be a mother from like 3 years old. Like as soon as I had the concept of being of parenting and being a mother,
yeah,
I knew. And it was also very clear to me that adoption and aunt and nieces, all of that was not sufficient. Like, I had this very deep inbuilt desire to grow humans, breastfeed humans, carry babies around. Like, it was this sort of very deep driven desire. And one of the things that I was incredibly lucky with is I had 3 pregnancies. I decided each time I was going to get pregnant, and I got pregnant each time within 6 weeks. So each time I decided this is going to happen, it happened. And my body was like, we're on. And it was like, okay, like this sort of, conceptual idea I'm having, and like, it's going to take, because you get these mixed messages. You get this, it can take a year to conceive, and that's perfectly normal. And then you have sex once and you're pregnant talk when you're in high school, right? So you get this sort of, and you're like, which way is it going to go? And it was like, oh wow, this is like really happening, and then I was a working mum for all of my kids, and I breastfed each of my kids. That to me was another really important sort of bonding thing. I really wanted that to work. And my first kid was born, I had partial previa and placenta abruptia, and he was born at 37 weeks, and his weight was dropping below 5 pounds, and they were like, we really want to give him formula. And I was like, not at 6 hours old, like he won't then go back to the boob. And so they said, you'll have to feed him every hour on the hour for the next 24 hours. And I was like, done, I'll do it.
Wow.
So I fed each of my kids for about 18 months, and it was wonderful.
Oh, wow. Amazing. One of the few things that really got me during our time together was actually again your honesty, and you're one of the most vivacious person I've ever met, and you wouldn't think that you've had the life that you had, just from a first impression. It is amazing. As I get to know more and more about you, it is amazing how you show up in the world. In fact, my first memory of you was the tattoo that you had on your thighs. Outrageous joy.
Yes.
Amazing. But behind that outrageous joy was also a very deep sadness, a very deep
Mm,
grief that you've had to walk, right? Both as a person, but also as a mum. Would you mind sharing with us a story about your son's journey?
sure. Yes. So I have three kids, and when my middle kid was my then youngest kid, he was 2 years old, and he started having all of these symptoms that basically were very gutty. It was lots of throwing up and lots of going to the ER, and like he's thrown up for 8 hours and not stopped, and there must be something. And the Thursday after Labor Day in 2008, when he was 2.5 years old, I ended up taking him to the ER. And after about 6 hours of testing, he was asleep. And the nurse came into my room and said, "Pediatric oncologist wants to talk to you," which is not the thing you want to hear. And I walked out into the hallway, and this sweet older gentleman looked me in the eye and he said, "I'm so terribly sorry, but your son has cancer." And we then navigated this journey. He had lymphoma. He had the tumor removed from his abdomen next to his appendix, a chunk of his large and small intestine removed. He had chemo. He then herniated and had to have more surgery, because when you start messing around with your intestines, they can sometimes herniate. And then the kind of cancer he had, they said, if it comes back in the first year, it usually comes back and kills. And 3 months after the initial diagnosis, he had his, every 3 months he was getting um, PET scans and blood work and all of the things, PET scans, and they thought it would come back in the neck. And they took out his adenoids and tonsils. And that week was this awful week. We were sort of waiting to see, and it hadn't come back. And he made it, and he's now a freshman at Emerson College in Boston studying film and journalism. But one of the things I mean, there were a couple of things that journey really taught me. One was the anger that he held on to over his sort of bodily autonomy, because there was a lot of me having to hold him down and physically restrain him for tests and scans and needles and IVs, was at the time was incredibly hard. And I felt terrible that he didn't really understand that I was doing this for his, for his safety, for his well-being. But I was interviewed for a podcast about 6 or 7 years later, and about 6 or 7 years ago, by a friend of mine who is an ex-British Marine who's been kidnapped 3 times, and he's now a resiliency coach. He's an amazing human. And through his line of questioning, I realized that Jamie holding onto his anger allowed him to like hold on to a sense of self, which is
Yeah.
really important. And I hadn't at the time really been able to understand that. The other thing that it really taught me was, the difficulty we have as mothers of, navigating something so traumatic and taking care of ourselves, because we just pour everything into our baby, right? It's like, what can I do? And I had a 4-year-old in preschool, and so I was taking care of him, and I was taking care of my husband, and I was, and I got to a sense of deep depletion because I was chronically serving everybody else, right? And that kind of
Yeah.
led me down my path to create a new life.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. How long was Jamie's initial treatment?
So it was September of '08 that he had the initial diagnosis. Then he was hospitalized, had chemo. Then January was when they had the next set of surgery. So it wasn't until, I mean, they basically, the kind of cancer he has, it's officially got to be 10 years, but they will, with this kind, release you at 5 years. So at 5 years, they said, he's quote unquote cancer free, but we want to check him at 10 years.
Yep. That is amazing. I think Looking back, it's easy to see all of the milestones, but going through the fog, going through the actual journey itself, it can feel very devastating, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Looking back now, though, as with everything that you know now, knowing that you have ADHD, that your kids also have ADHD, but also equipped with the strength and all of the necessary knowledge that you know now, how would you navigate it differently if you could turn back time?
how would I navigate it differently? That's a really good question. I think, in many ways, I look back and think I did the best I could. And I was very lucky that my parents flew out from London and lived with us for that first 3 months, which was really incredibly helpful. The bit that I struggled with was, and that sort of was part of the kind of ending to downfall of my ex-husband's and my relationship, is how you navigate two people going through stress who deal with stress differently. Right. So my response to stress in that situation was to journal more, to meditate more, to have more green smoothies, and basically go down this sort of like super over the top healthy. I'm going to make my kimchi from scratch, and I'm going to make my kombucha, and I'm going to make the bread from scratch that hasn't got all the, all the preservatives and crap in it, and I'm going to make my own sun cream from coconut. And I went down this like sort of insane, slightly, like sort of wellness path,
It,
right?
it
Go to
gives
bed
you the
early, get up
ability to
early.
control, right? What you can
Right.
control
That was
amongst
the
all
way
of
I
the
did it.
chaotic. Yeah. Mm.
Right. And my ex-husband's response was to do things like buy a pig and half a cow and make sausages and drink wine. Right.
Yeah.
So he went down the like, let me indulge in life and experiences, and he'd be like, drink wine and I eat steak. And I was like, no, I'm going to bed and meditating and having a green smoothie and picking dandelions out of the garden to put in my smoothie.
Yeah.
And so we
Yeah.
sort of diverged very much. And that
Yeah.
that ended up creating more of a clash.
Yeah. Yeah. And one becomes almost the opposite of what you're trying to achieve, right? And it
Yeah.
becomes almost like you're not really getting it, and therefore you're not really getting me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And then you talked about well, eventually you parted ways with your ex-husband. Are you able to share share as much or as little as you like about that journey as
Sure.
well?
Sure. One of the upsides to my son navigating cancer was that I'd really wanted a third child. And when we'd gotten through the it's not back in the neck and the next scan, my ex-husband was like, let's embrace the crazy and have the third child.
Wow.
And I had a daughter, which was wonderful. So I have two sons and a daughter. So as we were navigating all of that, life just got more stressful. And we, you know, couldn't find a way really back to each other. And his response again to the stress was to sort of withdraw from me. And he walked out on our marriage 4 times. The first time when our first baby was just 6 weeks old, 7 weeks old.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and um, the fourth time he walked out, I decided that I wasn't going to stay, because the third time I decided to stay for the sake of the kids.
Hmm.
And I thought, I'm going to do that classic thing, wait till the youngest goes to college and then sayonara,
That is a
you
long
know,
wait from 7 weeks. Yeah. Okay.
right?
Yeah.
And so when he walked out the fourth time, it was 6 months after my cousin, who was like my brother, had died of leukemia. He and I had grown up together. We were like brother and sister, and he died of leukemia and we were 37. And so when my ex-husband walked out the fourth time, I thought, I felt like I was sort of empowered as I thought of my cousin, and thought like, I need to live for me. I've spent, the last 15 years living for everybody else. It's time to live for me. And we went through a divorce, which ended up being quite brutal, quite difficult. I've had to take him to court twice more since then. And one of the things that I've worked really hard to do, I'm a Buddhist. And one of the first teachings I had, which I love and I return to frequently, is that like hatred, resentment, anger towards another person is like drinking poison and hoping the other person is going to die. right? And I feel that vitriol from my ex-husband a lot. And I just think, you're the one that's drinking the poison. You're the one that's suffering. And, a couple of things that I've had to do in the interim is to, I don't have any contact with him now. It's all through a lawyer. And that was a
Mm.
boundary that I established because he
Yeah.
has quite narcissistic tendencies and will try to create fights and wants you to get involved. So he would
Yeah.
do this thing where like the kids would be with him for a week and then the kids would come to mine, and he knew that I was going to be like flying to Mexico to meet my parents and do something fun with my kids. So he would launch an attack, in the hopes to make our vacation hard and to make life, And so I tried the gray rock approach, which is a sort of an approach for navigating narcissists, which is, you get the email or the text and you just say, noted, right? But that didn't work. And one of my children does not have a relationship with their father. One has a slightly tenuous and one sort of okay. And I think part of it is because that vitriol that he lives in is, they feel, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It can be a little bit tricky in the beginning, though, especially you and I share this journey earlier on. But when the kids are still small, did you get a conflicted feeling between, yes, their dad is a narcissist. It's probably not the best personality to share parenthood with. However, he's still their dad, and they do still need to spend some time. It's like which is the lesser of the two evil, right? And
Right.
so was it hard for you to navigate earlier on, and how did you manage that?
Sure. So one of the things that was very clear to me is that I wanted my children to have their own relationship with their father and make their own decision about it. And that if I said he's this, he's that, you shouldn't, he will do this,
Mm,
then would they really believe it? Right.
yeah.
So it was very important to me that they came to their own conclusions about who he is and how he shows up in the world. So, when we first separated, my youngest was 4, my middle was 8, my oldest was 10. We did a 60-40 split where it was like 2 days, 2 days, 4 days, 6 days, so back and forth. And then we went to week on week. But
Hmm.
my oldest, who was 10, when we told them we were getting a divorce, he said, "You're doing it to save the relationship." And
Oh,
I was like, huh? Like he
yeah,
could see. And about 2
yeah.
weeks after we weren't living together anymore, he said, "You're happy, Mom." And I
Oh,
thought, oh God, I thought I'd been hiding it, you
yeah.
know,
No, they
but I
know.
hadn't. They
Kids
knew.
know.
And
Yeah,
that to me, like, I felt like I was modeling
yeah,
choosing myself, choosing
yeah,
happiness, choosing them in a different way than
yeah,
staying with him would have done and shown them.
yeah. That is amazing. Oh, thank you for sharing.
Welcome.
Kids are just our teachers, aren't they?
They really are.
I'd like to go back to that story about your cousin who
Mm,
unfortunately lost his battle with leukemia. On your website, you mentioned that he believed that the stress that was building up in his life has
mm,
somehow made its own way towards his internal lives, and
mm,
ultimately that resulted in cancer. Um, I have made similar observations as well, but as someone who actually works about people's mindset and how the daily habits they do in their lives really transformed not just their physicalities but also their whole life, right? Do
mm.
you agree with your cousin's observation?
I think that the mind is incredibly powerful, right? And
Mm,
the mind can create great impact. And um, we as we start to understand, like, so for example, like heart math, has been studied in the last few years, and the electrical signals from your heart extend 30 feet out from your body, and your heart sends more signals to your brain than your brain sends to your heart, right? So changing the electrical frequency of your heart by getting into a state of gratitude and compassion literally will emanate different electrical waves to the people around you, when you walk into a space, right? So stuff that
Wow, I didn't
sounds
know that.
it
Awesome.
sounds kind of spiritual and like crazy is actually
Yeah.
sort of grounded into that's one of the things that I love. So my doctorate is in neuroscience, and then I'm trained in Ayurveda and yoga, and all of these appreciative and all these sort of things that are more sort of spiritual slash applied slash grounded in not necessarily in the body, right? And we're starting to see that there's actually data that backs up all of this, right? And so
Yeah.
one of the things that, so Mark was this incredibly nerdy scientist, and we were 3 months apart, and his father was going through medical school when we were growing up. So
Oh,
often
wow.
he was with me, my parents, my grandparents, and he was one of those kids who would say things like, did you know that the sperm whales, whatever, or the blue whale's penises, or, the speed of a fart is, and he was always the one that would say the thing that would make you like die of laughter, right? And he played Dungeons and Dragons and top trumps, and he was this super nerdy kid, right? Like bottleneck glasses, like just like wonderful. And he was also interesting because he never had kids, but he was one of those people who would walk into a room and pick up a crying baby and just soothe the crying baby. And I could never do that until I had my own kid and like knew I could do it. Like I always loved kids and wanted to be around them, but until I'd like been through it with my own kids, I was like, I can't pick up another baby, I might mess it up. Right.
Yeah.
So he worked for a company for many years, as a just sort of crunching numbers and doing data and theory and like sort of in the sort of intellectual space of the organization. And a few years before he died, they moved him into compliance. And he suddenly moved to being somebody who had to go around and find everybody who'd broken the rules and report them, which completely did not go against, like went against his entire sort of energetic framework. Like it was so misaligned with his gentle, sweet, nerdy nature. And so that was the sort of the turning point that he felt like he'd started to sort of feel that resentment instead of expressing it externally with a therapist or a punching bag or whatever. He turned it in. That was one. And then his parents' marriage was struggling too, and he was trying to be the support structure for that. So there were these sort of things going on in his life that he really felt sort of affected his mindset, right? Affected his mental state. And we know there's really compelling data that shows that meditation affects the telomeres at the end of your DNA. So essentially, like the more you meditate, the more the telomeres at the end of your DNA grow. And that's associated with longevity, well-being, health. And so we know, right, that the mind, we know that with the placebo effect, right? Like there's so many places where data is growing that shows the effect of the mind and the body. And so he is somebody who, as he was dying, he and I had all these conversations about like, if he got through it, what could he do differently? What changes would he make? Would he leave the company? Would he go and do something else? Like, would he, go and climb a mountain somewhere and get a reset and do something completely different?
That is amazing. Sorry to hear about your loss. But I guess one of the beautiful and bitter things about life is that we tend to carry our pain to propel us forward. And one of the biggest legacy, I guess, that Mark has gifted upon you is to lead you to this path of being the chief habit scientist now. Would you be able to share with us what you do?
Sure. So I think of myself as a neuroscientist who studies habits in teams and relationships and organizations. So I use the chief name as like as like the CEO, right? And I'm going to empower you to create your own habits. So what I do is I help people figure out the habits that are hindering them and the habits that can propel them to success, whether they are their own individual personal habits like meditation, managing your inbox, etc., or the habits of how you organize your team, you run your company, you run your business, right? And a lot of the way I work is using the lens of conscious leadership and appreciative inquiry. So conscious leadership, the way I define that, conscious means aware and leadership means impact, right? So understanding and being aware of the impact you're having on those around you. And appreciative inquiry is a technique that came out of the work by David Cooperrider at Case Western Reserve University in Ohio, where I did my executive coaching certification. And it's a lens of going into a system, a situation, a relationship, a problem, looking for what is working rather than what is not working, right? Our brains are designed to scope the woolly mammoth, right? So it's against our natural inherent evolutionary nature. But actually, when we go into a system and say what's working, it unleashes a level of creativity that you don't get when you go to the negative.
Interesting. All right. I really like what you've listed on your website as well. You equip leaders to cultivate emotional intelligence, psychological safety, and self-trust. And psychological safety is something that is quite interesting that that I have been trying to build in my academia world with the students as well. But my question is, at least in the organization and especially in the executive level, where things are a little bit more high stakes, for someone who didn't really grow up with psychological safety and who didn't have it as an example in their lives, how can they cultivate psychological safety, not just outwardly, but also internally?
So there's two things that I do with everybody in this space. The first is Maslow's hierarchy is a really good way to sort of start looking at that. So if we think of it in a crude way of three chunks, the bottom chunk is basic needs: sleep, food, home. Is your mortgage being paid? Are you well set? The second level is safety and is love, safety, and belonging. So are you part of a team? Are you loved? Are you known? Are you missed? Do people know when your birthday is, what your favorite hobby is? And then the top is transcendence, finding your purpose, for want of a better description. It's also very much associated with creativity, innovation, which is really important in an organization. One of the things that we get stuck in our modern world, particularly where I live in the US, where we're terrible about not having the social services to provide for people, and we give people crappy vacations and so on. And, we don't even have maternity leave in this country, but that's another whole conversation, is we focus on that top level, the creativity, the innovation, but we forget, do people feel like they belong in the team? Are they seen and known? And are their basic needs being met? Are they getting the right kind of food, the right kind of sleep, etc.? Right. So one of the things I'll say is, like, yes, this is really important, but it's not going to work if you don't go low. And if you then look at the brain, there's many models of dissecting the brain, but one of them that fits really well with this is the triune model, which is that the brain developed up and forwards, right? So we've got the nervous system, then we've got the reptilian, then we've got the mammalian, and then we've got the frontal cortex. So these three evolutions of the brain, right? And those map to those three Maslow triangles, right? So basic needs, the basic kind of functioning of the nervous system, right? Then we get to safety and belonging. That's amygdala, that's fear, that's the kind of core part of the brain, that middle bit, which we try to manipulate: fear, fawning, fighting, fleeing. And then we get to the prefrontal cortex, the most evolved part of the brain, and that's associated with the innovation, the creativity, the transcendence, right? So what I'll say to people is, when we think about an organization and we're getting stuck in innovation and all of that, it's like, are the lower ones met? So that's the first thing. And if not, what can we do as an organization to change that, right? The second thing is that people feel you, right? So one of the things that I will always do with any team I work with, and I do strategic planning and sort of facilitated events, is I create safety by asking people to reflect deeply and then share in small groups. And that's a really big way of creating psychological safety and connection, is helping people say, the reason I'm here, the reason it matters, the reasons it's important. And so I will ask questions again in this appreciative inquiry lens, which is looking for what's working. Like, why am I here? Why is it important that I'm on this call right now? Why is it important that I'm doing this job right now? How does it impact my children, my family, my community, right? As an example question. And then rather than sharing it into a room of 30 people, in a breakout room, turn to two people next to you and have the
Yeah.
conversation. And one of the things that I always do in these facilitated small groups is it's not a conversation. When somebody shares, I say to the people who are listening, listen with your entire body. So if somebody says, it's really important that I have this job because I am the first person in my family who went to college, and holding down this job and earning money and showing up and doing it is really important because I'm modeling this success for my daughter. It's also really important because the mission of this organization is tied with who I am in the world, and I really value the mission, right? Somebody else who's listening in their small group might say, I felt my throat constrict when you said that because my mother is a first generation immigrant, and I felt those pressures, right? And rather than having a conversation, they just say, I felt it, right? I see you. And the thing that people always report back is that 90% of the time we have transactional and promotional conversations. I'll get the kids at 2, let's buy this software, let's get Chinese takeout. Being in a situation where somebody can truly listen and you feel the effect of that full attention, it totally shifts the dynamic. So rather long answer, but those are sort of 2 frameworks.
Yeah, interesting. I felt like I was writing down notes all along, and when you said listen with your whole body, I just put my pen down and just totally listen. That's amazing. Um, okay, as it reflects to psychological safety, I do want to ask about um, if you are someone in the lower rank of the organization and the organization itself lacks psychological safety and you don't really have any say as to what can be implemented to cultivate that, if you are aligned with the overall mission of the organization, what options are available or what would you recommend that person do to navigate this? Should they keep their heads down and just move on with what is expected? Should they move on to a different type of organization with similar mission? How can they enhance the psychological safety without having the authority to do so?
So a couple of things. Firstly, I think, one of the things that great companies do is 2 things in this space particularly, is that the C-suite team, the upper level managers, are comfortable saying, I don't know, I got it wrong, I need help, and model that to everybody around. Second is they bring in people like me who create events where you remove hierarchy. One of the things that I always do when I work with teams is I say, we're going to problem solve around this, not based on your job title or where you are in the hierarchy, based on what you understand and feel and think about this problem, right? So that's how I would approach it from that level and that angle. The individual person, I would say to them, is there a way that they can build that sense of safety and belonging with their peers, if not necessarily with their advisors? Is there a way that they can build a community of people who are at the same level of them, who they trust, who they can show up for each other? So for example, when I was growing my business and I was first divorced, I got together with a couple of other parents, and we would, 1 day a week, each of us would take all of the kids home and feed them, so that the other
Oh,
parent,
nice.
right,
Yeah.
would have another 3 or 4 hours of a working day, and we weren't having to pay for babysitters, right? And then
Yeah.
you'd go and pick up your kids at 6 and they'd hung out with their friends, done their homework, and been fed. Bingo. Right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
can you find a community that supports the things that you're struggling with, the difficulties you're need, right, at the peer level? So that would be one thing. The second would be, is it something like you're going through medical school and it's an incredibly, or you're a teacher, you're in a very structured hierarchical environment where there is a time limit, and there's a time limit, or law firm, right? So
Yeah.
you want to get there, you're going to get to the top there, it might take you
Yeah.
10 years to get there, but there's a very clear structure. And so then the
Yeah.
question is what you're going through right now worth it, and can you find extra support to get you there? That's what I would say.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you.
Okay.
You also spent some time teaching yoga as a
15
neuroscientist.
years
Yeah,
Yeah.
as a neuroscientist, I find it really interesting. How does daily yoga practice transform your brain?
Oh, so many things. So there's the student and the teacher. So I'll talk a little bit to both sides if that's useful. So as a student, one of the things that I loved about practicing yoga was my proprioceptive awareness, which is the awareness of my body in space, and my interoceptive awareness, which is the awareness of what's going on from the inside out, my senses, right? Because when you are in an unhappy relationship, marriage, job, you often fall into people pleasing techniques and tools. And what that means is that you are constantly looking out to make sure that the emotional environment around you is happier, better, more balanced. And so you stop paying attention to, do I need to pee? Am I thirsty? Am I tired? Because you're just constantly navigating everybody else, right? So the practice of yoga, personally for me, constantly brought me back, similar to meditation, to myself, to my body, to my experience, and reminded me that this is my vessel, this is what I'm thinking, this is what I'm feeling, and reminded me how to stay in touch. That was one thing. Another thing that the practice of yoga has been sort of fundamental in is my ability to be flexible. One of the things that people often say to me, oh, I can't do yoga, I'm not flexible. And I'd always say, it's not about your body, it's about your mind. The flexibility of your mind is way more important, right? So, for example, if you're in a class, like I went for many years to an Iyengar class, and Iyengar is very different from the kind of yoga I taught. I taught vinyasa flow, chaturanga, music, fun, quotes. Iyengar is everybody in the room does the same thing. There's no music. It's all very structured. And if somebody's doing something funky, the teacher might say, everybody stop, come to Tamsin's mat. Okay, so watch as Tamsin presses through her big toe, lifts her arch, presses down through her right heel, pulls her calf muscles up, engages her quads, pulls the hamstrings under her buttocks, how her hips level out. And the whole room is like looking at me, right? I love that because I felt, now I understand with ADHD, like I understood the rules, but it was also incredibly informative. And within a few months, I was able to hold a headstand for 5 minutes, right?
Oh,
Through
wow.
this very dedicated practice, right? And even with my
Yeah.
third kid, I held a headstand on her due date. There's a photograph of me with this
What?
40-week pregnant belly doing a headstand, right? So those are some
Wow.
of the things that I loved. And then, of course, the community and the people who you show up with every day, right? And
Yeah.
take your classes. As a teacher, there were a couple of things that were huge. One was I would say something like, lift your pubic bone towards your navel. And some people in the room would do that. And then other people wouldn't. And I think, okay, lift your front hip points up to your lower ribs. Some people in the room would engage. Other people I'd
Yeah.
say, pull your belly button towards your spine. So
Yeah.
teaching yoga and finding ways to explain things, get people to do things with their body, and when they're moving their body and it's not a psychological or emotional concept, you get that immediate feedback of, did my words make sense? So
Yep.
for 15 years I was going into all of these different rooms and studios saying stuff and going, well, that worked, that didn't work.
Yeah.
Right, that made
Yeah.
sense, that didn't make sense, right? And so it was a really good kind of
Ah,
crucible, for want of a
interesting.
better word,
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
really learning about the power and impact of my words, which as a facilitator and speaker and coach is huge. What
Yeah.
words am I using? How am I asking the questions? When am I making a statement? How soft am I? How loud am I? How exploratory am I? Right?
That is interesting. I wouldn't link yoga and for a lack of a better word, maybe emotional intelligence.
Oh,
Not
it's
just,
huge.
yeah.
And also, it was also that I was trained. So yoga arose in countries that were either Buddhist or Hindu. So most teacher trainings focus on one or the other. And I was in a Buddhist training. And we went into every class with the message of, how can I be helpful? That was your first doctrine in my yoga teacher training. How can I be helpful? The second was to pick a psychological concept and translate it into the physical experience, so that when people left the room, they had something to work with. So a classic example was, the story of a musician who went to the Buddha and said, how do I tune my, it was like a lyre or something, like it was something with strings, how do I tune it so that it makes the most perfect noise? And the Buddha said, not too tight, not too loose. So then I would I would tell that story, and then I'd go into the class and I would get them to hold a pose, and I would have them extending their arms out left and right. How can you hold your arms up for 20 breaths? Not too tight, not too loose. Are you using your back muscles? Are you using your pecs? What about your trapezius? What about, right? Not too tight, not too loose. And then when you leave the mat and you go out into the world, every interaction you have for the next week, how can I think not too tight, not too loose, as I support my kid, as I have a conversation with my partner, as I fill in the blank?
Yeah. Wow. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing.
Welcome.
Did you teach your kids that philosophy?
Well, yes, and like your kids don't want to learn what you're a master of, right? Or not, I mean, master is a strong word, but like, like I'd be like, come and meditate. And when they were very little, they would meditate with me. And then they were like, that's boring. Or like, that's the stuff that takes mommy away from me. Like, I'm not going to be interested in things, right? So yes, and I think one of the things, all of my kids have had extensive therapy. COVID was difficult for them. They all have all done extensive talk and group therapy. And one of the things that they have all gotten really good at is establishing their boundaries, being able to ask for what they want and ask for clarification. And I had a really interesting conversation with one of my kids who said to me, thank you for giving me the chance to have lots of therapy, because it allowed me to ask my girlfriend how she wants to be loved.
Oh.
And thank you for showing me how to love somebody, because I know how to love somebody. And it's little moments like that, that I'm like, oh, I don't think I did such a crappy job after all.
Yeah. Yeah. Huge pat on the back. Well done, Mum.
Yeah.
So, you are now repartnered. Well, tell me a little bit about your life now. You mentioned the word yummy multiple times when we last texted each other. Yeah.
My life is really. I grew up in London. I lived in the Midwest for many years. I moved to Brooklyn, New York 2 years ago, and it's been really interesting because I've been learning how to create this life for myself without my kids in the home. It's wonderful because I'm one flight from them, one flight from London, and I live in a city where, like, in the last week I went to an album launch party, I went to a loft Spanish guitar event, I walked my dog in the park with bagels, I went to see Project Hail Mary in this little independent hippie theater. Like, it's just all out there and I love it. I went to see gallery exhibits at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and all on public transport. Yay! So I live in this city that's really thriving and fun and intellectually stimulating. I'm one flight from all the people I love, which is amazing. And about 14, 15 months ago, I met this guy. And we met because our kids were in the same, doing the same thing. And we were like it was the sort of new parents meeting. And we met and we were both dating other people. But we had this kind of like, oh, we both work for ourselves. We both live in Brooklyn. We're both Buddhists who like to meditate. We both travel a lot. He's been to 66 countries. We're both big foodies. We both have difficult relationships. We had this kind of like, oh, it was just this sort of meeting of, so we, over the next sort of 8 or 9 months, we became friends. We would like wander around the Botanical Garden together. We would go to Carnegie Hall and see a concert. We would, we would go and do meditation retreats together. Sort of half-day sits at the local, Zendo. And what that did was that it allowed us to see who we really are as humans, right?
Yeah.
And then at the end of August, early September 25, we got together of the like kids back to school. How was your summer? Let's go for a drink. And I was like, okay, I've been single for about 6 months. I think I'm going to like hold my nose and jump into the online dating pool in New York, although I have to admit I'm slightly terrified because I've never done it on that scale, because I'd lived in small Midwest towns before, where sometimes I would get to the end of all my Bumble matches and they would go, you need to be willing to meet people who are 100 miles away from where you live, or you need to be willing to date people who are over 70. And I was like, that's okay. So I knew it was going to be a very different thing here. So I was saying to him, I was like, okay. And I said to him, like, when you got on the apps, like, any tips? And he was like, don't get on the apps, go on a date with me. And I was like, oh. And I had a crush on him ever since I'd first met. I was like, I always thought it was incredibly attractive, but was very, was like really enjoying our friendship.
Platonic, right?
And I've never dated somebody who I've been friends with before, and it's wonderful and lovely. And he is a documentary filmmaker, and he is
award-winning documentary filmmaker,
multi Emmy award winning. And he used to be a photojournalist, and he was the longest embedded photojournalist with the Marines during Afghanistan and Iraq in the early 2000s. And he's amazing photographer too. But because he's a photographer, journalist, documentarian, he's an epic observer. So he's somebody who doesn't speak until he's got something amazing to say. He doesn't just speak to fill the gap. He's also incredibly good at cooking, which is so fun. And and is a real caregiver. Like, in the morning we'll wake up and he will make me coffee, he'll turn the shower on. While I'm in the shower, he'll make me breakfast. And I've never dated somebody who like takes care of me in that way, like picks me and my kids up from the airport, even if it's horrible times of the day, walks my dog when I've got the flu. Like, just, he's an incredible caregiver, but he's also just really smart and funny and engaging. And we have this amazing time together, and it just has allowed me, I'm going to be 50 this year, to really think, this amazing future. His father remarried and has been with his second wife for 30 years. And so he and I were like, oh, we could do that. We could have 30 years together. How amazing would that be? But no, I'm really, really loving my life here. I think partly it's because I'm living in a part of the world too where I don't have to hide who I am. In the Midwest, I don't like American sports. I'm a Buddhist. I don't go to church, right? And I'm really, really quite left-leaning in my politics. And I'm living in a city where I don't have to hide that.
Yeah, you can do all that. Yeah,
I can do all of that and be out there and free, and it feels wonderful. And I have these wonderful friendships who, I created a book club inadvertently when I moved to New York, and there's a core group of 4 of us, and we meet once a month. And we read and we cook and we hang out, and we have what we call spiritual friendships, which are really, we're committed to saying when we hurt each other or do things that upset each other, because we want that level of deep intimacy where we show up for each other. And I'm going to be 50 in June, and I'm having a party in London, and 60 people have RSVP'd yes, from countries from like Brazil and Mauritius and Germany and California. People all over the world have said they want to come and celebrate, which is such a wonderful feeling for me, to bring together people from all of these parts of my life.
Yeah. What a rich life you have. Well done.
I'm very lucky.
How does your relationship feel like now compared to your first marriage? Knowing that, what works and what doesn't work, if something is in alignment with who you are, how could you exert your own, I guess, for lack of a better word, what you were mentioning before, sovereignty. How can you actually maintain your sovereignty in a relationship that sometimes demands something of you as well, whilst exerting your boundary? In other words, what's different this time around, Tamsin? Give us the goods.
So whenever I start becoming friends with somebody or dating somebody, there's 2 things that I always do as a kind of test to see, are we gonna become really good friends or lovers, right? The first is cook together. How do we cook together? Do we have you diced the onions too small? Why did you cook it that much? I said medium rare. Like, why did you fill the wine glass? Right? Can we partner on something, or put together IKEA furniture, right? Doing something where you got to navigate the stress a little bit. The second is to travel, and again, navigate other people. Are you courteous when the flight's cancelled, delayed, things are lost, broken, damaged? You know, do you get grumpy? Like, how do you both deal with that? And does it work? And Lucian and I went to London to stay with my parents for 8 days, 4 months into dating. So he sort of got unleashed on my family.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And flight was delayed. And, you know, and what's interesting is that he's a big history nerd, and he was like, can we go and see Lord Nelson's boat in Portsmouth, you know, HMS Victory? And I was like, sure. And he's funny. And so we were going down there. It's like a 2-hour train ride each way, you know. He was like, can I mansplain for a bit? And I was like, you go for it. And he's like, gave me the whole download of, you know, HMS
I like that he
Victory
asked
and
for
Lord Nelson.
permission first. Very courteous.
It's lovely. It's really lovely. So we had this day with 2-hour train ride down, like 6 hours wandering around Naval Museum, you know, and then a 2-hour train ride back. Normally, after being with anybody for that amount of time, I'll be like, I'm going to get in the shower, have a glass of wine. I don't want to talk to you.
Yeah.
I got back to my parents' apartment with him, and I wanted to sit next to him. And I was like, oh, like his energy is soothing to me. So that was the first thing that was really noticeable. The second was watching how he engaged with my friends, my brother, my parents. And my mom is a big foodie. And it was super sweet to watch him and my mom like talk recipes and foods and things in the kitchen. So seeing that was also just a really lovely moment. So, you know, I mean, it's interesting. I think sort of some of the big changes is I'm willing to say what I want, and I'm able to say what I want because I feel safe saying what I want and need. That's one of the
going
first
back
things.
again to that psychological safety. Yep.
Right. The second is he pays attention to the things when I say this is important, or I like this, or I don't like this. And it can even be like the little things. Like the other night we went out and neither of us we weren't starving, so we decided to share a burger at his local pub. And I don't like raw onions on the burger. And so when it arrived, he sliced it in half and he scraped all the onions onto his half of the burger. And it's just those little things like that I'm just like, oh, you know, these little noticings that are not right. And so I think it's having been friends first, which is really hard in this day and age to do. And I'm so grateful that we had that experience, allowed me to see how he showed up as a father, how he showed up as a friend, how he showed up as a boyfriend to the woman he was dating. What things
that's really important. Yeah.
You know, so we went like we would go to these Sunday meditations, and he one day texted me and he goes, I'm going to go to like 2 Indian stores and 2 Chinese stores to get all of my spices and sauces, because he's a big foodie. He's like, do you want to come along? And I was like, again, like this sort of like epic, you know, he's like, I'm not just going to go to the local grocery store. It's like, I go to this place to get this soy sauce, and I go to this place to get the chili, and I go to this place to get the wonton wrappers, and I go to this place to get the garam masala, and you know, and like learning who he was when I didn't have the skin in the game.
Yeah,
it was great.
Yeah, awesome. I want to go back to that post-separation, post-divorce time to where you are right now, the messy middle, when the kids are still so quite young and they still need you both physically but also emotionally, but you're still struggling to maintain balance in your life, trying to achieve that self-transcendence as well. How did you juggle work and family and all of those conflicting demands? Looking back now, what were the things that went well for you, and what are the things that you think could have been done a little bit better, knowing, you know, everything that you know now?
2020, right? So not the year, but the 2020 vision.
Yes.
Hindsight, just clarifying, not talking about COVID. So it was 2014 when this all went down. And so one of the first things because I work for myself, I could create, you know, a lot of my own boundaries. And so I shifted when I taught yoga. I used to teach a lot of 6 a.m. classes, which I didn't want to do when I only had my kids, because that would have been very complicated, right? So the first thing I did was I took charge of my schedule, and I basically worked from like 9 to 3 every day, so that when my kids came home from school from 3 to 5, I was completely available, whether it was like in my room and they had friends and they were doing things, but I was there and available and in the house if they needed me, if they wanted to engage, I would make them snacks, etc. So that was the first thing it is. I took charge of my schedule so that when I was with them, I was available as much as possible. The second thing I did, and actually, like, I've found since moving to New York and not having the kids in the house, that's been hard because the only thing I have to do is walk my dog, right? I'm like, there is no structure to create pressure to get work done in time windows now, right? Which is great for the ADHD, right? The second thing I did was, when I didn't have my kids, I made sure I had a lot of fun, but not to the point of like exhaustion and depletion. But it was the first time that I remember, the first weekend I didn't have my kids. And one of my girlfriends was like, you'll spend the whole weekend in tears. And I was like, don't think I will. But, my first weekend, I went on a date and I spent like 2 hours having a bath, doing my hair, like getting ready. Normally it would be like 15 minutes, put on some lip balm or gloss and like run out. I was like, I can prepare, right? The Sunday morning, I like got the Sunday Times and I went and I sat for like 2 hours in the local coffee shop and read it cover to cover, right? Again, like it was normally like I'd be reading like one paragraph and then I'd be like, oh, don't hit your brother. We need to go to Target to get supplies for, I indulged in that way. And that filled my cup. Right. I lent into my relationships, my friendships. I went and took yoga classes. I, went and learned how to, I took dance classes and I took pole dancing classes and I bought an electric guitar and had a guitar lesson. You know what I mean? I was like, I could put this focus and energy on me and not feel guilty that I'm paying a babysitter because they're with their father, right? They're in a loving, contained home, right? And so those were the two things. It's like, created my schedule. Oh, and then a third thing, which I only realized during COVID when I didn't have it anymore, was that whenever I had my kids, I made sure we went to see my parents. So my parents live in London and I was in the Midwest. And so every 3 months we tried to see each other. Either they would come to us or I'd go to them. And what they did for me when I went to them was so incredibly supportive, is that they took charge. They filled the fridge. They booked the events, which meant that I could release the decision making, which is something that as a parent, a business owner, a single parent, divorcee, co-parent, you do all of the decision making. You have to manage everything. And so for a week, not having to think about any of that was so relaxing to my nervous system.
Yeah. Interesting. Yes, I know that of which you spoke of. I wanted to talk about a little bit quickly about the you mention on your website you believe that repair is greater than perfection. And I guess in this aspect, you're referring from a professional point of view. I really love the work of Dr. Becky. She psychologist, specializes in kids education, and she talks a lot about showing up as a parent. You don't really need to be perfect, because no one is. But what is more important is the repair that comes after the rupture, right? It's really funny. I was just having this the other day, just yesterday. My son, he's 10-year-old, and every time I would take a juice out of the fridge, he would take a few gulps here and there. And I was having a really long day. I had my dinner. I was about to have it. I took, a glass full of juice, and I just wanted to have my dinner and my juice. Right? I took care of everything else and everyone else. I just wanted to have those two, right? He walked and then he took a gulp and I lost it. I was like, can I just have a glass of juice on my own? Yeah. It's so funny. He just looked at me. He didn't even get angry. He was like, unbelievable. He said, unbelievable. And obviously I was still fuming, right? I'm like, I'm gonna have my juice. You can take your own juice if you wanted. And then of course the next day I was like, oh, maybe I was being a little bit ridiculous that day. So I went to my son again and I said, hey, Roger, the other day when you took my juice, and said yes. He knew exactly what I was talking about. And I said, I guess I was a little bit ridiculous, wasn't I? I said, I'm sorry. And here's a Gatorade to make it up. And it's like, oh, thanks. So, so I guess, from a personal and parental point of view, yes, repair is important, and it's probably the imperfection is almost required so that we can do the repair, right?
Right,
Because
right.
otherwise life will be very bland.
Hmm.
But from a professional point of view, how do you maintain that repair, especially again on a higher level of the organization where there may be quite a few egos at play,
Hmm.
and it may not necessarily be beneficial to you to admit fault.
Hmm.
What would you recommend?
So I think, one of the ways that I will often, frame this in, and it's a conversational or a sentence structure that I found to be helpful there is, I'm telling myself the story, dot, dot, dot. Right? Because doing something like that goes, I'm noticing this pattern, right? That, you know, I'm the female and I always bring the coffee, or I always am the person who's expected to lay out the chairs, or fill in the blank, right? And so, I'm noticing this and I'm telling myself this story. Is this true? Right. So what you're doing there is you're not blaming somebody, but you're taking charge of the situation. You're saying, I'm noticing this, I'm seeing this pattern, I'm seeing this behavior. And for want of an explanation, I've created an understanding and explanation for myself, because that's what we do as humans.
Mm-hmm.
But I would love some clarity, right? And not doing it in a way that's like publicly humiliating or anything like that, right? So that's an example. And to the point you're making about repair, if we one of the things that I will often see in situations, particularly where there's hierarchy or very expectations that maybe don't make sense to you, or I coach somebody who could only motivate his employees around making money, and I was like, not everybody cares about it as the prime source of motivation. Some people are doing this because of the values, the mission, the hope, the impact it's having on their family, etc., etc., right? The intellectual engagement, fill in the blank, right? And so, one of the things that I will, flag is, what are the values, the vision, the rules here, and can we have a conversation about what's really going on here, right? My job title says this, but I'm doing this is a mismatch, right?
Mm.
And if you're living in a state of anxiety, that creates burnout, right?
Mm.
If you're living in a state of anxiety, you are constantly on alert, and you're not going to be able to get into that state of innovation,
Mm.
into that state
Mm.
of creativity, into that state of collaboration, right? So one of the things that I'll say to people is that if you are feeling that anxiety, and it's not just because you haven't slept, or you've had 3 coffees, or you took 20 grams of milligram of Adderall on an empty stomach, have the conversation, because it may be that there's nothing there, right? It's like saying to somebody, I'm really sorry, and sometimes people will go, I didn't even notice, and it's all in your own head that you've offended them or upset them, right? And they didn't even notice it, right? So rather than letting that anxiety build up, which the energy of which people will feel is I always say to people, just go for it.
Mm. Interesting. Yeah, we are but the stories that we tell ourselves. So
Right.
sometimes it's good to clarify that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I know that you're a very busy person and it's probably very late there. So I don't want to take you too long. I want to keep you too long. Just one question that I ask all guests on the Breadwinning Mums show. What is your power song? So if you have lots of things going on, at work,
um
at home, personal lives, what is one song that you play on the back of your mind?
um okay, so I think probably it would be, I worked with a business coach for a while, who every time I made a sale, she said, play the song and
Yeah,
imprint it into your nervous system and dance.
yeah.
And it is a song that always makes me feel very like raw, which is Born This Way by Lady Gaga. Because for me, it really is. It's like owning who you really are, whether it's that you're part of the LGBTQ community, whether it's that you have great thoughtful opinions about things that not everybody else likes, that that you love fart jokes, that whatever it is that's your thing, right? Like there's something about this is who I am, and I'm unapologetically owning it. And it's got a great beat. I grew up in that like 90s house music, dance era.
Awesome. Well, Tamsin, thank you so much for your time. I feel like I could speak with you all day. I hope this is not the last time we'll have you on the show. But thank you so much.
I loved it.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Dr. Tamsin Astor. I hope to see you next time.
Sounds wonderful, and I'd love to come back. Thank you for all the insightful questions, Jane.
Perfect. See you then.
This episode of The Breadwinning Mums was produced by me, Jane Lim, and our theme music was produced by Sam McNally. We recorded this episode on the lens of dark people who have passed their parenting story for generations. We pay our respects to their elders past and present, and thank them for caring for country. Connect with us through LinkedIn or Instagram at Breadwinning Mums. Until next time.